Hey guys, tonight I need to tell you about 41 people. Not 41 documents, not 41 letters, not 41 intercepted dispatches carrying a queen's handwriting across a border. 41 people, 41 human beings who walked into a courtroom on the island in the middle of Paris, stood up and said what they had heard. That is what the case was made of. Mouths. Over 2 days in October of 1793, the Revolutionary Tribunal of the French Republic tried Marie Antoinette of Austria, widow of Louis XVI. The charges included emptying the treasury of France, corresponding with the enemies of the Republic, and conspiring to set civil war burning inside the country. The hearings ran about 20 hours. 41 witnesses were heard. 12 jurors sat. 4 questions were put to them. And not one piece of paper proving the central charge was ever produced in that room. I want to be precise, because precision is the whole point of this channel. The prosecution's case rested on the claim that she had passed money and military intelligence to France's enemies. The correspondence that would have shown it was searched for. It was not found. The public prosecutor's file on that charge was, in the words of one legal historian, rather empty. Her own defense counsel would say afterward that his entire argument rested on the absence of proof. The jury voted yes on all 4 questions. They voted out loud. That was not an accident, and it was not a scandal. It was the law. The decree that created that tribunal specified that jurors would form their declaration publicly, aloud, by absolute majority. Every man in that box knew that every other man in the room could hear him. The verdict came at about 4 in the morning on the 16th of October. She was asked whether she had anything to say against the application of the law. She shook her head and said nothing. She was dead at 12:15 that same day. Now, before we go one step further, I need you to hold on to 3 things, not as a tease. I am going to name all 3 of them plainly, right now, and then I am going to spend the next 2 hours showing you what each one of them actually means. The first thing is a word. The word is brioche. It is a French word for an enriched bread made with butter and eggs. In English, it has come down to us as cake. You already know the sentence it lives in. Hold on to that word, because we are going to take it apart very carefully. The second thing is a number, and the number is 8. 8 leaves of paper. That is the physical length of the act of accusation that the clerk of the court read aloud to her on the first morning. 8 leaves. Now remember that number, because there is a second document in this story that is also counted in 8s, and nobody ever heard a word of it. The third thing is a signature. On the 6th of October, 1793, in a tower in Paris, an 8-year-old boy signed his name to a statement about his mother. The signature survives. It is shaky. Hold that too. Word, paper, signature. Plant them somewhere in your mind and keep them there. Here is what this is not. This is not a video about whether Marie Antoinette was a good queen. She was not, by most measures that matter to a country in a fiscal crisis. This is not a video about whether she was innocent. I am going to show you, in some detail, that on the central charge in that indictment, she was not innocent, and that the historians who have looked hardest at her correspondence say so. That is going to be uncomfortable, and I am not going to soften it. This is a video about the difference between being guilty and being convicted. Those are 2 different events, and they happen in 2 entirely different places. One of them happens in the world, The other happens in a room, according to rules, on evidence. In October of 1793, in the Salle de la Liberte, in the Palais de Justice in Paris, those two events came apart completely. A woman who had genuinely done a version of what she was accused of was destroyed by a proceeding that could not prove any of it, and that reached instead for something else. That gap between what was true and what was proved is the whole story. Everything else is scenery. If that is the kind of story you came here for, the version where the record is stranger and harder than the version you were handed, then subscribe. So the next time we open a file like this one, you are already here. Now, we cannot start on the 14th of October, 1793. If we start in that courtroom, nothing in it will make sense. By then, the verdict had already been written by about 30 years of paper that had nothing to do with a court. So we have to start somewhere else. We have to start with a sentence in a book. It was written by a man who never met her, about a woman he did not name, at a time when Marie Antoinette was a child in Vienna who had never seen France. Let me read you the sentence. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Confessions, Book 6. The French is this. Enfin, je me rappelais le pis-aller d'une grande princesse, à qui l'on disait que les paysans n'avaient pas de pain, et qui répondit qu'il mange de la brioche. J'achetais de la brioche. In English. Finally, I recalled the last resort of a great princess who, on being told that the peasants had no bread, replied, "Let them eat brioche. I bought brioche." Read that again, slowly, because there are 4 things inside it that almost nobody knows, and every one of them matters. The first, the word is brioche, not cake. Brioche is bread. It is bread with butter and eggs in it, which is why it costs more. But it is bread, and it comes out of a bakery. The English word cake is a translation artifact that arrived later and changed the whole meaning. Rousseau's princess is not saying let them eat luxury. She is saying something stupider and stranger. She is saying, if the cheap bread has run out, buy the expensive bread. She does not understand how bread works. That is the joke. The second, Rousseau names nobody. Une grande princesse. A great princess. No name, no date, no country. And the verb he uses is je me rappelais. I recalled. He is not reporting something he witnessed. He is repeating an anecdote that was already in circulation before he wrote it down. The third, and this is the one that guts the myth entirely. The passage is not about a princess at all. It is about Rousseau. He has some wine. He wants bread to go with it. He is too well dressed to walk into an ordinary baker's shop without embarrassing himself, so he stands in the street, working out an excuse, and the excuse he lands on is the princess line. It is a joke he makes at his own expense to justify going to a pastry shop instead. And the fourth. The sentence that follows is almost never quoted. J'achetais de la brioche. I bought brioche. He bought the bread. The whole thing is a paragraph about a man being too vain to buy a baguette. Now hold that against the chronology. Books 1 through 6 of the Confessions were written somewhere between 1765 and 1767. The sources differ, and I am not going to pretend they do not. Marie Antoinette was born on the 2nd of November, 1755, in the Hofburg in Vienna, the 15th child of the Empress Maria Theresa. When Rousseau wrote that sentence, she was 9, or 10, or 11 years old, depending on which year of composition you accept, and she was in Austria. She left Vienna in April of 1770. She married the Dauphin of France on the 16th of May, 1770. She became Queen of France on the 10th of May, 1774. Rousseau died on the 2nd of July, 1778. He never met her, and there is no evidence that he ever wrote about her at all. And it gets worse for the myth, because the historian Antonia Fraser dates the anecdote itself, as opposed to the writing of it, to about 1737. Rousseau was recalling something from that period of his own life. If that dating is right, the story was already old 18 years before Marie Antoinette was born. So who else has said it? The most commonly named earlier candidate is Marie Thérèse of Spain, the wife of Louis XIV, who married him in 1660. Her version is not brioche. Her version is, why do they not eat the crust of the pie? And here is the detail I love, because it is exactly the kind of thing the record throws up when you actually go and look. The source for attaching the line to her is a memoir by the Comte de Provence. The Comte de Provence was Louis XVI's brother. He was Marie Antoinette's brother-in-law. He was arguing that the line was not hers. It has also been attributed to Madame Victoire, a daughter of Louis XV, in the memoirs of the Comtesse de Beaune, and in that version something remarkable happens to the meaning. Beaune reports Madame Victoire saying it in tears, not with contempt, with distress. She meant, if there is no bread, let them at least have the pastry crust. She was trying to feed people. The same sentence, in the same century, in the same court, carrying the exact opposite of the meaning history has assigned it. It has been attributed to Madame Sophie, another daughter of Louis XV, to Madame de Pompadour, to Madame du Barry, to an unnamed Duchess of Tuscany. Alexandre Dumas put it in the mouth of the Duchesse de Polignac in a novel in 1853. Folklore scholars have collected a 16th-century German version in which a noblewoman tells the poor to eat a sweet bread called crosum, and the oldest one is not European at all. In the Book of Jin, the Chinese emperor Jin Huidi, who reigned from about 290 to 307 of the Common Era, is told that his people have no rice. He asks why they do not eat meat porridge. That is the same story, roughly 1450 years earlier. That is not a quotation. That is a folk motif. It is a wandering tale that attaches itself to whichever powerful person is currently available to be hated, and it has been doing that for at least 17 centuries. The scholarly study is by Véronique Campion-Vincent and Christine Chaujaï-Kawan in the Annales historiques de la Révolution française, and their argument is the correct one. The phrase is not evidence about Marie Antoinette, it is evidence about how scapegoating works. So when was it first attached to her? Not in her lifetime. I want to be careful with a negative claim, so let me be specific about where people have looked. It is not in the pamphlet literature of the 1780s. It is not in the revolutionary press. It is not in the act of accusation drawn up against her. It is not in the Moniteur's coverage of her trial. It is not in any known testimony from that courtroom. It is not in her correspondence. It is not there. The earliest written trace anybody has found is from 1843, 50 years after her death. It was a satirist named Alphonse Karr, writing in a monthly pamphlet called Les Guêpes, the Wasps. And here is the reversal. Karr was not making the accusation. He was trying to kill it. He said he had found the line in a book dated 1760, and he offered that as proof that the rumor about Marie Antoinette was false. Sit with that for a moment. The earliest surviving document that connects Marie Antoinette to that sentence is a document written to prove that she never said it, which tells you two things at once. It tells you that we can date the earliest written trace precisely. And it tells you that we cannot date the rumor, because Carr was answering something that was already loose in the air, and we do not know how long it had been there. As for his book dated 1760, no scholar has ever found it. He never produced it, and I am not going to stand here and tell you that it exists. So the most famous sentence in the history of the French monarchy was not said by the woman it is attributed to. It was not used against her at her trial. It was not used against her by her enemies while she was alive. It enters the written record half a century after her head came off, in a document arguing for her innocence. Now, if they were not using that, what were they using? Because something was being said about her for 20 years before that courtroom, and it was worse. They were called libelles, slanderous pamphlets, broadsheets, songs, mock plays, forged memoirs. Most of them were printed outside France, in London and Amsterdam and the Low Countries, to get around royal censorship, and then smuggled back in. The writers were nicknamed the Rousseaus of the gutter, which is a better joke than anything in this story deserves. And a lot of them were not written out of political conviction. They were written for money, and the French crown had a habit of paying libelists to suppress editions, which did exactly what you would expect it to do. It created a market. A man named Charles Thévenot de Morand built an entire career on it, blending pornography with corruption allegations against the royal family, and then charging the royal family to make it stop. Here are the two numbers you can actually cite. The scholar Hector Fleischmann catalogued 126 pamphlets, specifically concerning Marie Antoinette's sexual conduct. Hilary Mantel has pointed out that this undercounts badly, because titles were reissued with supplements, pirated and forged, so the number of distinct printings is far higher. And before 1789, roughly 1 in 10 pornographic libelles in France targeted the Queen. From early 1789 onward, the overwhelming majority did. That switch is the story. In 1788, she was one target among many. By 1789, she was the target. The historian Robert Darnton has written that the avalanche of defamation against her in those years had no parallel in the history of vilification. That is an unusually strong claim, coming from a very careful historian. The master text was called the Essai historique sur la vie de Marie Antoinette. It began as something in the early 1780s, was suppressed, was reprinted, and by 1789 had grown to 146 pages, compiling 12 years of accumulated accusation. Estimates of how many copies were circulating by 1789 run between 20,000 and 30,000. There were others, Le Godemiché Royal, L'Autrichienne and Goguet's, Les Amours de Charlot et Toinette. I am not going to read you the contents of any of them. The register is what you would imagine, and it does not get better. But I want to point at the political payload underneath the pornography, because that is the part that mattered. The Essai historique did not only claim that she was unfaithful, it claimed that she had taken a lover in order to conceive, which is an attack on the legitimacy of the heir to the throne of France. That is not gossip. That is a constitutional weapon dressed as filth. 2 words came out of that period, and both of them ended up doing work in the courtroom. The first is Madame Déficit. It was coined in 1787, during the financial crisis under Calonne, when the Assembly of Notables was told how much the state actually owed. And there is a documented moment that is better than any pamphlet. In August of 1787, Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun's portrait of the Queen was pulled from the salon because of her unpopularity. Somebody pinned a note to the empty frame. Voilà le déficit. Behold the deficit. An empty frame with the word deficit on it. That is the whole political situation in one object. The second word is Autrichienne. It means the Austrian woman. It also, unavoidably, contains the French word chienne, which means bitch. The pun is not something a translator can carry across, and it is not something a French speaker can avoid hearing. Every single use of that word about her was a slur about her nationality and a slur about her sex at the same time, and it had followed her since she arrived in France in 1770. There were factions at that court that had never forgiven the Franco-Austrian alliance of 1756. After the diamond necklace affair, which we are coming to, the chants described her as a monster escaped from Germany, worse than Cleopatra, worse than Agrippina, worse than Messalina, worse than Catherine de' Medici. Now hold that list. In October of 1793, the public prosecutor of the French Republic stood up in a court of law and compared the accused to Brunehaut, to Frédégonde, and to Medici. And before that trial was finished, the court would hear her called the new Agrippina, and a Messalina too. The vocabulary of the gutter pamphlets walked into the courtroom and put on a robe. That is the argument the scholar Chantal Thomas makes, and I want to state it carefully because it is the single most useful idea for understanding what happened in that room. Thomas reads the pamphlets not as testimony, but as an autonomous system, a body of writing with its own internal logic and its own escalation, which does not need contact with the real woman and does not seek it. Her thesis is that this discourse escalated across 20 years, from spendthrift to adulteress to something worse, and that it culminated in a physical destruction. Mantel's phrase for the mechanism is the sharpest I have found. The symbolic violence of the pamphlets cried out to be made real by action. There is a live disagreement here, and I am not going to pretend there is not. The historian John Hardman thinks the Libelle scholarship is overrated. He argues that concentrating on the pornography distracts from her real political activity, which he considers substantial, and which we are going to examine in detail. Lynn Hunt argues the opposite, that the sexualization of the Queen was structurally necessary to the Republic defining itself, and that as the Austrian woman, daughter of the hereditary enemy, she was expendable in a way her husband was not. Both of those can be partly right. In fact, I think they are. And by the end of tonight, I think you will see why. Hardman is right that she did things. Hunt and Thomas are right that what killed her was not the things she did. So that is the ground. A folk anecdote she never said, misattributed to her 50 years after her death. A pamphlet industry that produced her as a character before any court produced her as a defendant. An empty picture frame with a note on it. And now we can go to the rehearsal, because in 1785, 8 years before the Revolutionary Tribunal, there was another public trial in Paris. It was about a necklace. She was not a defendant. She had done nothing. She lost anyway. And the way she lost that one tells you exactly how she was going to lose the next one. The object was a necklace, and it was a monstrous thing. Nearly 650 diamonds. Something close to 2,800 carats. A row of 17 stones across the top, each of them about the size of a hazelnut, and then festoons and pendants hanging off it in 3 descending wreaths. Thomas Carlyle described it, and even he sounds slightly stunned. It had been commissioned by Louis XV from the crown jewelers Baumer and Bassange as a gift for his mistress, Madame du Barry. Then Louis XV caught smallpox and died, in 1774, without paying for it, which left two jewelers holding the single most expensive unsellable object in Europe. The asking price was around 2 million livres. The price it was eventually contracted at was 1,600,000. To give you a sense of scale, when the necklace was offered to Marie Antoinette in 1778, she is reported to have said that France had more need of ships of the line than of necklaces. That is the right comparison. The necklace cost about what a first-rate warship cost. She turned it down. She turned it down again in 1781, when the jewelers tried to sell it after the birth of her son. She never owned it. She never saw it. She never signed anything about it. Now here is how she was destroyed by it anyway. There was a woman named Jeanne de Saint-Remy de Valois, who called herself the Comtesse de la Motte. And the strange thing about Jeanne is that her claim was partly real. She was genuinely descended from Henri II through an illegitimate line. She was a Valois. She lived on a small royal pension in the outer dark of a court that had no use for her. She was not lying about her blood. She was lying about her access. And there was a man named Louis de Rohan, Cardinal de Rohan, Grand Almoner of France, prince of one of the great houses of the kingdom, former ambassador to Vienna. And the reason the Queen loathed him is documented and specific. While he was ambassador in Vienna, he had reported gossip about her conduct back to her mother, the Empress Maria Theresa, and he had written mockingly about the Empress herself. Marie Antoinette froze him out completely. He wanted a ministry. More than that, he wanted to be forgiven. That is the hinge, not greed, the desire to be forgiven. Every good confidence trick is built on a thing the mark already wants, and Rohan wanted absolution from a woman who would not look at him. In March of 1784, Jeanne became Rohan's mistress and began telling him she was received in the Queen's private circle. Then she produced letters. They were forged by her live-in accomplice, a man named Rétaux de Villette, who could imitate the Queen's hand. And here is the tell. The one detail in this entire affair that should have ended it in an afternoon. The forged notes were signed Marie Antoinette de France. Queens of France did not sign that way. They signed with their baptismal name only. There is no such signature, and there never was. And Rohan looked at a signature that does not exist in French royal practice, and believed it. A prince of one of the oldest families in the country, Grand Almoner of France, a man raised inside that court. When Louis XVI was finally shown that letter, it was this that enraged him. Not the fraud, the fact that a Rohan did not know how a queen signs her name. Then came the garden. On the night of the 10th to the 11th of August, 1784, in the grove of Venus in the gardens of Versailles, Cardinal de Rohan met the Queen of France. Except he did not. He met a young woman from Paris named Nicole Leguay, hired for the evening because she resembled the Queen. She stood in white muslin in the dark. A rose was handed to the Cardinal. He heard one sentence: "You may now hope that the past will be forgotten." 8 words in French. And then the meeting was broken off and she was gone. Darkness, a costume, 8 words, and a man who wanted to believe. On the 21st of January, 1785, Jeanne told Rohan that the Queen wished to buy the necklace secretly and needed him as intermediary and guarantor. He negotiated. He signed. On the 1st of February, the necklace was delivered, and Rohan carried it to Jeanne's lodgings and handed it to a man he believed was a royal valet. It was broken apart within days. The stones went on to the black markets of Paris and London and were gone. In July, Boehmer sent the Queen a letter thanking her for the purchase. She read it, did not understand a word of it, and burned it. On the 1st of August, the first installment fell due, 400,000 livres. There was no money, because there had never been a purchase. Boehmer went to the palace, and on the 15th of August, 1785, the Feast of the Assumption, Cardinal de Rohan was arrested in the Hall of Mirrors. He was in full pontificals. He was minutes from saying the Assumption Mass in front of the entire court of France. Now, that arrest is where the crown lost. The king had two choices. He could handle it privately, by royal authority, and bury it. Or he could send it to the Parlement de Paris and let it be tried in public. He sent it to the Parlement, and the accounts say he did that at the Queen's insistence, because she wanted a public vindication. She wanted her name cleared in open court. What she got was a public trial about whether something was plausible, whether the Queen of France would meet a man alone at night in a garden, whether she would buy a 1.5 million livre necklace behind her husband's back, whether she would use a disreputable adventuress as her go-between, because that was Rohan's defense. That is what he said in his own words. I believed it was possible. And on the 31st of May, 1786, the Parlement de Paris acquitted him, fully, without stain. I want you to follow the logic of that verdict, because it is the exact logic of the verdict 8 years later, running in the opposite direction. To acquit Rohan of fraud, the court had to find that his belief was reasonable. His belief was that the Queen would behave that way. Therefore, the acquittal of Rohan was, in substance, a judicial finding that the Queen's character made the fraud credible. Nobody said that. Nobody had to. Paris understood it immediately. Rohan was cheered in the streets. Jean de la Motte was convicted, whipped, branded on each shoulder with the letter V for voleuse, thief, and sentenced to life in the Salpêtrière. She escaped in June of 1787, dressed as a boy, fled to London, and published venomous memoirs, which is how the affair went on, generating pamphlets for years afterward. And the king, having sent the case to a court, then exiled the man the court had cleared, which somehow made the crown look worse still. The Château de Versailles, in its own official account today, puts it about as bluntly as an institution can. Her reputation was tarnished and never quite recovered. She, the Queen, was the scandal. She had done nothing. Rétaux de Villette confessed to the forgeries. The court itself found Rohan a dupe, and the La Mottes the authors. Antonia Fraser is categorical that Marie Antoinette had no prior involvement and no advance knowledge, and the Château de Versailles takes the same position officially, and it did not matter at all. Her public appearances all but ceased. The pamphlet production exploded. Look at the shape of that. A public tribunal, a fabricated documentary record, a verdict that had nothing to do with the evidence in front of it, and a woman convicted in the street rather than in the room. That is October of 1793, arriving 8 years early as a rehearsal. Now the ground begins to move. The 5th of October, 1789. Bread was expensive. Working people in Paris were spending close to half their income on it. There were rumors of an aristocrat's famine plot. And on the 1st of October, there had been a banquet at Versailles for the officers of the Flanders Regiment, at which the tricolor cockade was reported, in a sensationalized press account, to have been trampled. The Queen had been present. She was blamed for it personally. Hold that, because it comes back in the indictment 4 years later, almost word for word. On the morning of the 5th, a young woman beat a drum in the Faubourg Saint-Antoine. Market women gathered. Church bells rang. By the time the crowd reached the Hôtel de Ville, it was somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 people demanding bread and arms. A Bastille veteran named Stanislas Marie Maillard took informal command, and it is worth saying that he spent most of the day restraining them. He stopped an arson. He cut down a man who had been strung up from a lamppost. At 4 in the afternoon, Lafayette left Paris with about 15,000 National Guards, having very nearly been mutinied against by his own men. The crowd marched for 6 hours in driving rain, dragging captured cannon with them. That evening, the king received 6 of the women, was sympathetic, and ordered food distributed from the royal stores. At about 6, he announced he would accept the August decrees and the Declaration of the Rights of Man without qualification. Lafayette arrived late that night and said, "I have come to die at the feet of your majesty," which is the kind of line that sounds better before dawn. The guards were withdrawn. 61 members of the king's bodyguard were on night duty inside the palace. National Guards and marchers mingled in the courtyards. At about 6 in the morning on the 6th of October, somebody found an unguarded gate. A royal guard fired and killed a young man in the crowd, and the crowd went for the queen's apartments, calling for her by name. One guard was killed immediately and beheaded. At least one more was killed and his head raised on a pike. A guard named Tardivet du Repaire was struck down outside her door. Marie Antoinette ran barefoot through the palace with her women to the king's bedchamber and hammered on a locked door until it opened. Her bed was found afterward with pike holes in it. Then Lafayette brought them out onto the balcony. The king first, and unexpectedly there was a cry of "Vive le roi!" Then the queen, holding her children, and the crowd shouted that she should come out alone. She sent the children back inside. She came out alone. She bowed. And the crowd, against every expectation in that courtyard, shouted, "Vive la reine!" It was the last time she heard it. That afternoon, the royal family was taken to Paris in a procession of more than 60,000 people that took about 9 hours. Guardsmen carried loaves of bread on their bayonets. Market women rode on the captured cannon, and some of the marchers carried the heads of the murdered guards on pikes in front of the royal carriage. They arrived at the Tuileries, a palace nobody had lived in since Louis XIV. Asked for his orders, Louis XVI said, "Let everyone put himself where he pleases." Then he asked the library to send up a history of Charles I of England. He knew exactly what was happening to him. He simply had no idea what to do about it. They never saw Versailles again. Now we come to the 20th of June, 1791. Pay attention here. This is the one charge in the indictment of 1793 that is unambiguously, provably true. The plan was to get the royal family out of Paris to Montmédy, a fortress near the eastern frontier, where the Marquis de Bouillé had assembled around 10,000 loyal troops. It was organized by Axel von Fersen, a Swedish nobleman, and by the Baron de Breteuil, the king's secret plenipotentiary abroad, with the backing of Gustav III of Sweden. They traveled on passports in the name of a Russian baroness. The children's real governess played the baroness. Marie Antoinette played the governess. The King of France played a valet named Durand. The 2 children were the baroness's daughters, which meant the 6-year-old Dauphin was dressed as a girl. 3 bodyguards were couriers, and the queen herself asked their Christian names and assigned them. And then there was the coach. Fersen had advised 2 light carriages, fast, unremarkable, and separate. Louis and Marie Antoinette insisted on one vehicle because they would not be separated from the children. What they got was a berline weighing over 2 tons, drawn by 6 horses, stocked with provisions and coin and diamonds, carrying something like 500,000 livres. It was the largest and slowest thing on the road, and it was carrying the entire escape. That decision destroyed it. They left around 1 in the morning on the 21st, with Fersen driving the coach himself out through Paris to Bondy, where he left them and rode for the Netherlands. By morning, they were 50 miles clear and undetected. Then a harness broke near Chalon and cost them an hour. The delays accumulated. At about 8 that evening, at Pont de Saint-Vesle, the cavalry escort was not there. The Duc de Choiseul had waited 2 hours past the expected time with his dragoons, decided the whole thing had been called off, and withdrawn. 2 hours. That is the margin. At about 9, at Saint-Menehould, the postmaster Jean-Baptiste Drouet looked at the man in the coach and recognized the King of France. The tradition is that he recognized him from his portrait on an assignat, which is to say, from the money. Drouet rode cross-country and raised the alarm ahead of them. Shortly after 11 that night, at Varennes, the coach was stopped. A grocer named Jean-Baptiste Sauce held them in the rooms above his shop and compared their faces to their documents, and eventually Louis XVI admitted who he was. Bouillet's son arrived with hussars around midnight, too late and unwilling to force it. Choiseul offered the king a sword. Louis refused it because there were children in the room. They came back into Paris on the 25th of June, in complete silence. Placards had instructed the crowd neither to cheer nor to insult. Men kept their hats on. Fraser's summary of the failure is the right one. For the want of a nail, the kingdom was lost. Now here is the legal consequence, and this is the load-bearing fact of the entire trial. The Assembly suspended the king's executive powers. To save the monarchy at all, it adopted the fiction that he had been abducted, which nobody believed. On the 17th of July, the National Guard fired on a crowd of petitioners at the Champ de Mars, and republicanism became a mass position overnight. And for Marie Antoinette specifically, Varennes converted her from an unpopular foreign queen into something with a documented file. She was now, on the record, a person who had attempted to reach a fortified position near the Austrian frontier with foreign organization and foreign money. Every single charge in 1793 about conspiring with foreign powers and planning civil war is retrofitted onto that night. It is the one accusation where the prosecution did not need to invent anything, because she had done it in a 2-ton coach in front of a grocer. Then, the 10th of August, 1792. On the 1st of August, the Brunswick Manifesto reached Paris. The Allied Austrian and Prussian commander threatened unforgettable vengeance, military execution, and the total destruction of the city if the royal family were harmed. It was intended to protect them. It read as proof that they were in league with an invading army, and Fersen had a hand in its drafting, which means the connection to her was real and not paranoid. 8 days later, the insurrectionary commune seized the Hôtel de Ville, and the next morning, the National Guard and volunteers from Marseille and Brittany attacked the Tuileries. The royal family left the palace early, and took shelter in the reporter's box of the Legislative Assembly. About 900 Swiss guards remained. From the assembly, the king wrote an order for them to cease fire and withdraw to barracks. They obeyed. Around 300 were killed at the palace. Up to 200 more died of wounds or were killed the following month in the September massacres. About 600 of 900 men died because they followed a written order from a king who was no longer in the building. On the 13th of August, the family was imprisoned in the temple. On the 21st of September, the convention abolished the monarchy. They became the Capet family. And in November came the iron cupboard. A locksmith named François Gamin, who had helped build it, told the interior minister where to find a concealed iron cabinet in the Tuileries. On the 20th of November, its contents were filed with the convention. It held the king's secret correspondence, including the payments to Mirabeau and dealings with a string of ministers. That cupboard ended all resistance to putting the king on trial. On the 21st of January, 1793, Louis XVI was guillotined on the Place de la Révolution. He was buried the same day at the Madeleine Cemetery on the Rue d'Anjou, 10 to 12 feet down, in an open coffin under 6 bags of quicklime. And then she outlived him by 268 days. For the first 160 of them, nothing happened at all. She was the widow Capet, in a tower, and the Republic did not know what to do with her. She was a hostage, a bargaining piece, a symbol and an embarrassment, and for 5 months she was simply left there while men argued. Now I have to stop and do the hardest part of this, because if I skip it, I am doing exactly what the pamphlets did, just in the other direction. Everything I have shown you so far builds toward a familiar story: innocent woman, fabricated evidence, show trial. And if I left it there, this would be a comfortable video, and it would be a false one. She was not innocent of the central charge. Let me be exact about what that means, because it is not the thing the tribunal accused her of, and the difference matters. First, from the moment she arrived in France in 1770, she was in regular private contact with the Austrian ambassador, Mercy Argenteau, who was her mother's handler for her, and who sent secret reports on her back to Vienna. That is not treason by any standard of the 1770s. It is ordinary dynastic practice. But it established a standing private channel between the Queen of France and a foreign court on day 1, and she never closed it. Second, during the War of the Bavarian Succession in 1778 and 1779, she actively pressed her husband to intercede on Austria's behalf, and she succeeded. The assessment recorded in the historical literature is that this created the impression, partially justified, that the Queen had sided with Austria against France. Note that phrase, partially justified. Third, Varennes, which we have just walked through, and which is not arguable. Fourth, after Varennes, she opened a covert channel with the Feuillant leader, Antoine Barnave, what John Hardman calls a form of epistolary government conducted by secret correspondence. She promised him 6,000 livres a month and 1,000,000 livres if he succeeded in restoring royal authority. And she was negotiating with Barnave, while simultaneously corresponding with the Austrians, and she was deceiving him. Barnave was executed in 1793. And fifth, in 1792, she passed French military information to the enemy. Hardman finds her clearly guilty of sharing the plans of campaign and attack with the powers France was at war with. Lynn Hunt agrees that she did it, and adds the qualifier that it made no real difference to the course of the war, both halves of that matter. I am not editorializing. That is the assessment of the historian who is most sympathetic to her political intelligence and most impatient with the pamphlet scholarship. He thinks she was a serious political actor, and the price of taking her seriously as a political actor is that you have to take her actions seriously too. So here is where we actually are, and it is not where either side of this argument wants to be. The woman on trial in October of 1793 had, in fact, corresponded with France's enemies during a war. She had, in fact, attempted to reach a frontier fortress with foreign backing. She had, in fact, run a secret paid political channel with a man she was deceiving at the same time. And the court that tried her could not prove a single one of those things. It did not have the correspondence. It never produced it. It searched and did not find it. What it had was 41 people and their memories, and a prosecutor who had a great deal of rhetoric and almost nothing in his file, which meant that when the machinery finally came for her, it was going to need something else to work with. It found something else, and the thing it found was 8 years old. On the 3rd of July, 1793, late at night, commissioners came to the temple with a decree of the Committee of Public Safety ordering that Louis Charles, aged 8, be separated from his mother. The account we have of what happened in that room comes from his sister. Marie Thérèse was 14 years old and she was standing there. She wrote it down afterward, in captivity and then in exile, and it was published in English as The Ruin of a Princess. I want to flag the evidence level before I read it to you, because it matters. This is not a court record. It is a survivor's memoir, written after the fact, by a woman with every reason to shape how her family was remembered. It was published under a restored monarchy that was actively manufacturing martyrs. That is a real problem, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. It is also the testimony of a person who was in the room. There is no better source, and there is not going to be one. She writes that her brother flung himself into their mother's arms, begging not to be taken, that Marie Antoinette refused for more than an hour and told the guards they would have to kill her first, that she gave way only when the commissioners threatened to kill both children. And then this line, which is the one that stops me every time. She took him and gave him into the hands of the municipal herself, bathing him with tears. She handed him over, herself, with her own hands. Now, a dramatist would not write that. A dramatist would have them tear the boy out of her arms, because that is cleaner, and it makes her purely a victim. Marie Thérèse wrote the harder version, in which her mother made a calculation and then performed the worst act of her life with her own hands to keep both children alive. That is one of the reasons I believe her. Afterward, the memoir says, Marie Antoinette asked constantly to see him and never obtained it. The boy cried for 2 days. He was given to a shoemaker named Antoine Simon, a member of the Cordeliers Club, who moved into the temple with his wife to take charge of him. What Simon did to that child is genuinely contested, and I am going to give you both versions, because the gap between them is instructive. The maximal version comes overwhelmingly from historians writing after 1815, under the restored Bourbons. In it, the boy's hair is cut. He is dressed in a red cap, taught obscenities, plied with drink, beaten, and woken repeatedly at night. He is doused with cold water when caught praying. He is called Wolf Cub, and he is made to sing revolutionary songs loudly enough that his mother can hear them through the floor. The minimizing version which appears in the same reference literature, says that, apart from teaching him bawdy songs and the language of the streets, he was otherwise treated reasonably. I cannot resolve that for you. What I can tell you is this. The maximal version comes from an institution that needed a martyr. The minimizing version is thinner, but it is not absurd. And the honest position is that we do not know how badly a small boy was treated in a locked tower by a shoemaker with a political appointment. What we do know is what happened on the 6th of October. In late September, Simon reported to Jacques-René Hebert that he had found the boy masturbating. On the 6th of October, 3 men went into that room. Jean-Nicolas Pache, the mayor of Paris, Pierre Gaspard Chaumet, the procureur of the Commune, and Hebert, who published a newspaper called Père Duchesne. In the political ecology of that year, Hebert spoke for the people who wanted the queen destroyed as a woman, and not merely convicted as a conspirator. The accounts say the child was intoxicated. They obtained his signature on a statement. The statement said that Simon and his wife had discovered him at self-abuse, that his mother and his aunt had taught him the habit, that they had made him do it while lying between them in bed, that on one occasion this had produced a swelling that required a bandage, which his mother forbade him to mention, and it named 5 men as having been unusually familiar with his mother and his aunt. He signed it. He was 8. The signature is shaky. Now, there were 2 other people who could have corroborated that account, and the Commune went to both of them. His sister, Marie Thérèse, aged 14, was questioned. She denied witnessing any such thing. They brought her brother in and confronted her with him directly, and he repeated and sustained his statement to her face, and she held. She said she had seen nothing. His aunt, Madame Elizabeth, aged 29, was questioned. She called the accusation an infamy too base to answer. She pointed out that the boy had had these habits long before, and that she had scolded him for them. When they pressed her, she stopped responding altogether and said her conduct ought to protect her from such a suspicion. 2 people, both in the same rooms, both under the same pressure, both facing the same men. One denied it. One refused to dignify it. The only signature they got was the 8-year-old's. Hold that. We are going to see it again in 9 days, in a courtroom, in front of 41 witnesses and a public gallery. Meanwhile, she had been moved. On the 1st of August, 1793, the convention decreed that the Revolutionary Tribunal was to occupy itself with the judgment of the widow Capet, without delay and without interruption, and that she was to be transferred immediately to the conciergerie. They came for her at 2 a.m. that same night. 4 commissioners of the Commune woke her, read the order, and took her out through the sleeping city and over the Pont Notre Dame. She arrived about an hour later. On the way out of the temple, she struck her head on a low beam. Asked whether she was hurt, she is reported to have said, "No, nothing now can hurt me." That is a reported saying, and I will not pretend it is a document. It is the kind of line that attaches itself to people. The conciergerie was known in Paris as the antechamber of the guillotine. It was not a prison where you waited. It was a prison where you were arraigned. Everyone in that city understood the transfer as the verdict. She was entered in the committal register as prisoner number 280. Now I want to be careful about what follows, because this is the single most romanticized stretch of her life, and the evidence is thinner than the popular account admits. The Centre des Monuments Nationaux is the French state body that runs the conciergerie. Its own official material says the details of her detention are not well known because they are tainted by numerous rumors and legends. When a national heritage institution warns you against its own tourist narrative, you should listen. So here is what is solid. A ground floor cell at or below street level, on the women's side, with a narrow window onto the women's courtyard. Brick floor, laid in a herringbone pattern. Damp. A canvas bed, 2 mattresses, a bolster, a light coverlet, a table, a couple of chairs, and a bucket. 2 gendarmes inside the room, day and night. And between her and them, a folding screen about 4 feet high. 4 feet. That is the entire measure of her privacy. For washing, for dressing, for the bucket. 4 feet of screen, and 2 armed men on the other side of it, permanently. I am not going to give you the dimensions of the room, because no reliable measurement survives. I am not going to tell you there were rats, because I could not find a source. What I will tell you is the 4 feet, because that number is documented and it does more work than any adjective I could put next to it. Her watch was on the wall, the one her mother had given her. It was taken from her later. She had her prayer book. She kept a lock of her son's hair and small portraits of her children hidden in her clothing. Her knitting needles were confiscated. The woman who attended her was called Rosalie Lamorlière. She was 25, a domestic servant in the household of the concierge, not a courtier and not a royalist agent, and she was not called as a witness at the trial. That is exactly what makes her valuable. It is also where the problem is. Rosalie's account was taken down by a Catholic priest somewhere between 31 and 44 years after the events, under a restored Bourbon monarchy that was in the business of manufacturing a royal saint. That does not make her a liar. It means everything she says is recollection, and I am going to label it that way. Rosalie says the Queen of France arrived at her last prison with no change of linen. The concierge's wife refused to supply any. A municipal officer named Michonis eventually brought a package down from the temple containing shifts, handkerchiefs, stockings, a white underdress. Rosalie cooked for her privately, bringing soup from her own kitchen. And there is one detail in her account that I keep coming back to, because it is the sort of thing nobody invents. Marie Antoinette was bleeding, heavily and irregularly, and she had been for a long time. Antonia Fraser, working from the documentary record, describes hemorrhages that had been part of the pattern of her gynecological history for years, and raises fibroids or an early cancer as possibilities. Fraser theorizes, she does not diagnose, and neither will I. There was no examination, no relevant autopsy, and no surviving clinical record. Anyone who tells you what she had is inventing it. What is documented is the bleeding, the exhaustion, and the fact that she was denied any privacy to deal with it. Rosalie says the Queen asked her secretly for linen, and that she cut up her own chemise and put the strips under the bolster. Now hold that for a moment. The daughter of the Empress Maria Theresa, Queen of France for 18 years, was being kept alive in that room by a 25-year-old servant cutting up her own underwear. Her hair went white. Observers who saw her put her age well above what it was. She was 37. And then, in late August, somebody tried to get her out. A royalist chevalier named Alexandre Gonce de Rougeville had been at the Tuileries on the 10th of August, 1792, and had helped protect her. He got into the conciergerie by attaching himself to an official visit by Michonis, who was a municipal officer and a prison administrator and who had legitimate access. Rougeville was wearing 2 carnations pinned to his lapel. He let one fall. Inside it was a note offering escape and money. How it was discovered is genuinely disputed, and I will give you all 3 versions. 1. A gendarme saw and read it. 2. The concierge's wife found it, and Rougeville ate it. 3. The Queen found it privately after they had gone, which the reference literature assesses as most plausible. But here is the part that is not disputed, and it is the physical detail that defines the whole affair. She had no writing materials. She had been deliberately deprived of them. So she answered by pricking out the letters with a pin. The reconstructed text of what she pricked into that scrap of paper is this: I am watched. I neither talk nor write. I trust in you. I shall come. Sit with that. A woman with nothing to write with, punching a message through paper with a pin, 1 hole at a time, in a room with 2 armed men in it, behind a screen 4 feet high. She gave it to one of the gendarmes, a man named Gilbert, to pass to Rougeville. Gilbert took it to the concierge's wife instead. From there it went to Meconis, and from Meconis into the record. There is a version, reported by the courtier Huet, in which her answer was a refusal rather than an acceptance. That would change the moral picture considerably. I flag it rather than smooth it over. The escape had been set for the night of the 2nd to the 3rd of September. Meconis would walk her out. Rougeville would receive her. It failed at the last door, because a guard said that if they carried the Queen away, he would call out the guard, and he could not be bought. On the 3rd of September, Gilbert reported the plot. She was interrogated over 2 days and told them nothing. Now watch what happens next, because this is the accelerant, and the sequence is very tight. The 3rd of September, the plot is exposed. It is proof of an active royalist rescue network, with reach inside the prison administration, because Meconis was not a smuggler. He was a municipal officer of the city of Paris. She stopped being a symbol that night and became an operational danger. The 5th of September, Robespierre at the tribune of the convention. The punishment of a tyrant, he asks. Will it be the only homage we render to liberty and equality? Terror is declared the order of the day. The 17th of September, the law of suspects. The 1st of October, Billaud Varennes demands she be brought before the tribunal. The 3rd of October, the convention orders it. The 6th of October, 3 men walk into a room in the temple and come out with an 8-year-old's signature. The 12th of October, at just after 6 in the morning, she is brought from her cell for a secret preliminary interrogation before the president of the tribunal, with the public prosecutor present. And on the same day, 2 lawyers are commissioned to defend her. The 14th of October, at 8 in the morning, the trial opens. From the decision to try her to the opening of the trial, 11 days. From the appointment of her counsel to the opening of the trial, 2. Let me tell you what the court she was walking into actually was, because the popular picture of the Revolutionary Tribunal is wrong in a way that matters. It was created by decree of the Convention on the 10th of March, 1793. Some sources give the 12th. 5 judges, 12 jurors, with supplementary jurors, 1 public prosecutor with 2 substitutes, all of them nominated by the convention. 2 features of that founding decree are worth stating in its own words. The first, judgments would be executed without recourse to the Court of Cassation. There was no appeal. A contemporary printing of the trial record says it on its title page. established to judge definitively and without appeal all conspirators. The second, jurors would form their declaration publicly, aloud, by absolute majority, not a secret ballot, and not unanimity. Every juror had to say his verdict out loud, in a public room, in Paris, in October of 1793, in front of people who would remember. And then there was the reorganization of the 5th of September, 5 weeks before her trial. It split the tribunal into 4 sections, and it transferred the power to appoint jurors entirely to the Committee of Public Safety and the Committee of General Security. So the 12 men who judged her sat under a law 5 weeks old that had handed the naming of jurors to the Committee of Public Safety and the Committee of General Security, and they had to vote aloud. But here is the thing I want to correct, because it cuts the other way, and it is the difference between an accurate account and a lazy one. She was not tried under the law of 22 Prairial. That law, which abolished defense counsel and witness testimony and reduced verdicts to acquittal or death, came in June of 1794, 8 months after she was dead. She had lawyers, witnesses were called and heard. She cross-examined. The procedure was still adversarial, which means the trial of Marie Antoinette cannot be dismissed as a machine with no moving parts. It had all the parts. They were simply pointed in one direction. Her counsel were Claude François Chauveau-Lagarde and Guillaume Alexandre Tronçon du Coudray. There is a commission dated the 12th of October appointing Chauveau-Lagarde, and it survives as a physical document in the Musée du Barreau in Paris. One academic account gives the 13th, which may be when they actually picked up the file. He was summoned from the countryside and arrived the evening before. When she had been asked whether she wanted counsel, she had said that she knew no lawyers. Chauveau-Lagarde's own account of walking into that cell is worth hearing, and again, this is recollection, written decades later by a man whose career under the restored monarchy benefited from having been her defender. Both of those things can be true. He describes going through 2 gates into a dark corridor, then a chamber lit by 2 small barred windows, divided in 2 by a screen, an armed gendarme on one side, the queen on the other, with a bed, a table, and 2 chairs. He says she was wearing a white dress of extreme simplicity, and he says that in presenting himself to her, he felt his knees trembling under him and his eyes wet with tears. Then he went upstairs to the registry to look at the evidence. His words, "There I found a pile of papers so confused and so voluminous that I should have needed whole weeks to examine them." He came back down and told her that it was not possible to read all of it in the time available, and that an adjournment was indispensable. She asked him who they would have to apply to. He says he dreaded giving the answer, and gave it quietly: the National Convention. She turned her head away and said, "No, never." She would not petition the men who had killed her husband. He then argued that she was not only the Queen of France, but the widow of Louis XVI, the mother of his children, and the sister-in-law of Madame Elisabeth. And he writes that at the words sister, wife, and mother, natural feeling rose above a sovereign's pride. She said nothing. She let out a sigh. Then she took up a pen and wrote to the assembly in their names, a few lines full of noble dignity, asking for time. She asked for 3 days. Now here is what happened to that request, and this is where the sources split in a way you should hear in full. Chauveau-Lagarde says the application was transmitted to the public prosecutor, who promised to submit it to the assembly, and then did nothing with it. The Musée du Barreau's material says she wrote to the president of the court asking for 3 days and that her request was never answered. And a legal history study says something worse than either. It says the request for a 3-day delay was suppressed from the official files. I want to be honest that I cannot tell you which of those is correct. What I can tell you is that all 3 versions agree on the outcome. She asked for 3 days. She was given none. And on any of the 3 accounts, the piece of paper on which the Queen of France requested more time to prepare her defense does not appear where it should appear in the record of her trial. That is our second document. Remember the 8 leaves. Now remember the 1 page that went missing. Monday, the 14th of October, 1793, 8 in the morning. Some sources say 8:30, and I will not pretend it is settled. The Salle de la Liberte, in the Palais de Justice, on the island in the Seine. It had been the great chamber of the Parlement of Paris, which is to say, it was the room where the old regime's highest court had sat, repurposed. The back wall was hung with speckled paper and carried the busts of Brutus and of Lepelletier. There was a large canvas of the Table of the Rights of Man. There was a raised platform at the front for the president's table, beneath Brutus. There were 2 long tables, supported by carved winged sphinxes, with carafes and glasses on them. 3 windows gave onto the Seine, and in a small room adjoining the court, there was a printing press, so that verdicts could be printed the moment they were pronounced. Think about that for a second. The room was built with a press attached. The sentence, when it came, would contain within its own text the order that it be printed and posted throughout the whole extent of the Republic. That courtroom was not primarily a place for finding facts. It was a publishing operation with a judicial front end. She was placed in a raised, enclosed seat in the center of the room, visible to everyone. The public gallery was full. The president was Marshal Joseph Armand Herman, aged 34, from Artois, which is Robespierre's country. He had been appointed president of the tribunal on the 28th of August, 7 weeks earlier, at Robespierre's instigation, replacing a predecessor who had been removed for being too moderate. The public prosecutor was Antoine Quentin Fouquier-Tinville, aged 47, who had bought a prosecutor's office at the Châtelet in 1774 and sold it 7 years later to clear his debts. The clerk of the court was Joseph Paris, called Fabricius. They began with her name. Her name, the president asked. Marie Antoinette of Lorraine and Austria. Her quality. I am the widow of Louis Capet, King of the French. And then the record does something that I find almost unbearable, and it is the kind of thing you only find by reading the actual printed proceedings. The contemporary English printing of the trial has her stating her age as 38 years. She was 37. She was born on the 2nd of November, 1755. She died 17 days short of her 38th birthday. The record got her age wrong. It is wrong in the printed proceedings of 1793, and the error has propagated for 230 years. And you will still find modern sources repeating it. I am not saying that means anything sinister. Clerks make mistakes, and people misstate their own ages. I am saying that the very first factual assertion entered into the record of that trial was incorrect, and nobody in the room noticed, and nobody has fixed it since. Then Fabricius stood up and read the 8 leaves. Fouquier-Tinville had drawn and dated the act of accusation on the 13th of October. He opened it by calling her the scourge and the leech of the French, and he invoked Brunehaut, Fredegond, and Medici, which is to say he opened a criminal prosecution by reciting a list of legendary wicked queens. Underneath the rhetoric, there were three principal heads: dilapidation of the public finances, including sums sent to her brother the emperor; intelligence and correspondence with foreign powers, enemies of the republic; and conspiracy against the internal and external security of the state, including a plot to kindle civil war inside the republic by arming citizens against each other. A contemporary English newspaper digested it into 15 enumerated charges, and the list is worth hearing because of how far it reaches back. The deficit and Cologne, millions of livres sent to the emperor, correspondence with France's enemies since 1789, using civil list money to pay agents, working for a counter-revolution, corrupting soldiers at the banquet of the 1st of October, 1789, exploiting their drunkenness, distributing white cockades, insulting the national cockade, approving all of it on the 4th of October, conspiring against liberty, attempting to produce a famine in 1789, concerting with Lafayette to massacre patriots, ordering the Swiss to fire on the 10th of August, and, at the end, incest with her son. Now look at those dates: 1789, the banquet, the cockades, the October days, the famine plot, the Champ de Mars, Varennes, in June of 1791. The French Constitution and Penal Code came into force on the 1st of October, 1791. On a strict reading of the law that court was administering, nothing she did before that date was justiciable at all. Not the banquet, not the October days, not the famine, not the Champ de Mars, not Varennes. The great majority of that indictment was time-barred by the Republic's own law, and it was read out in open court anyway, by the clerk, to a full gallery, from 8 sheets of paper. I am not editorializing. That is the assessment in the legal historical literature, and its conclusion is stated plainly. The jurors and judges declared the Queen guilty because she was an enemy of the Revolution, not on proof, on conviction. She was interrogated by Herman, and I want to give you her answers, because they are on the record and they are better than anything a scriptwriter would give her, on her connections with her brother the Emperor Joseph, that he was her brother, that the connections she had with him were only those of consanguinity and not of a political nature, on sending millions to Austria, never, that she knows this has frequently been used against her, that she loved her husband too much to squander the money of his country, on the secret nocturnal committees at the Tuileries, that the rumor of those committees has constantly existed whenever it was intended to amuse and deceive the people, that she never knew such a committee, that it did not exist. Then Herman put to her that she had taught Louis XVI the art of profound dissimulation, by which he had too long deceived the good French nation. And she said this: "Yes, the people have been deceived, cruelly deceived, but it was neither by her nor by her husband." By whom then? Herman asked. By those who felt it their interest. It had never been theirs to deceive them. Read that again, slowly. She agreed with the accusation and then took it away from him. Yes, you were lied to. Not by us. On Varennes he pressed her hardest, and this is the exchange I most want you to have. He put it to her that she was the principal instigator of her husband's treason, and that it was by her advice and her importuning that he resolved to flee France. Her answer, that her husband did not wish to quit France, that she followed him on his journey, that she would have followed him anywhere, but that if she had known he wanted to leave his country, she would have employed every possible means to dissuade him. What was the purpose of the journey, he asked. To procure himself that liberty which he could not enjoy here in the eyes of any person, and to conciliate all parties, for the happiness and tranquility of France. Why did you travel under the borrowed name of a Russian baroness? Because we could not get out of Paris without changing name. And then, answering a question about somebody else entirely, she gave them something they had not asked for. She said that as regards the departure itself, she alone had opened the door and made everybody go out. Hermann seized on it immediately. From this confession, he said, that you opened the door and let everybody out, there remains no doubt that you directed Louis Capet in all his actions and made him resolve to fly. And she answered, that she did not believe the opening of a door could prove that a person directs the actions of another, that her husband desiring and thinking himself obliged to go out with his children, it was her duty and her assent. That is not a defense lawyer's answer. That is a woman under interrogation for her life, distinguishing between agency and compliance, in real time, on a day whose sittings ran, by one scholarly account, some 13 hours. He asked her whether she wanted to reign at any cost, and to climb back onto the throne over the corpses of patriots. She said that they did not want to climb back onto the throne, that they were upon it, that they had never had any other desire than the happiness of France. Let it be happy, let it only be happy, and they would always be contented. He asked about the banquet of the 1st of October, 1789, and he loaded the question. He used the word orgies. He described the guards trampling the national cockade and putting on the white one, and asked whether she recalled saying she had been enchanted by that day. She said she did not recall saying any such thing, but that it was possible she had said she was touched by the first sentiment that animated the festival. And I want to be exact here, because this is where documentaries cheat. The word orgies is in his question. It is not in her answer. She did not concede it. She acknowledged attending and denied seeing the cockade trampled. He asked about the 10th of August and the Swiss Guard firing on the people. She said she was not in the castle when they began to fire, and that she only knows that no order was ever given to fire. And then he asked her whether she regretted that her son had lost a throne he might have ascended. Her answer, she shall never regret anything for her son, so long as her country is happy. He asked whether she thought kings were necessary to the happiness of the people. She said an individual could not positively decide such a matter. And somewhere in those 2 days she said this, and the record does not preserve what prompted it. My plan is not denial. It is the truth that I have said, and I persist in it. And in one exchange about her children's education, from a Paris paper of that October, she said something so ordinary and so domestic that it does not belong in that room at all. Asked about what her son had been told, she said, "He was too young to speak to him of that. I had him placed at the end of the table." Historians who have read the surviving record say she was never once caught in a contradiction across 2 days. Now the witnesses. 41 of them called across 2 days and 4 sessions, and I have to tell you that we cannot recover all of their names. The complete roll is in a scholarly edition of the Tribunal's Acts that I could not obtain, and I am not going to invent a list. Here is who we can identify from the contemporary printings. A National Guard commander from Versailles, who deposed about the banquet and the October days. An adjutant general who deposed about the Tuileries. a surgeon and cannoneer named Roussillon, who deposed about the 10th of August, and who told the court he was personally convinced of her guilt because he had seen bottles under her bed, a notary who deposed about the night of the flight, a justice ministry clerk who deposed about the return from Varennes, the former procureur of the Commune of Paris, a gamekeeper, a servant maid named Millot, who gave hearsay about money sent to the emperor and about the cockades, a gendarme, the concierge's wife, and the prisoner's attendant, all deposing about the Carnation, a painter named Bose, who had painted her, deposing about a reconciliation project. That is the case. That is what 41 people produced against a charge of transmitting military intelligence to an enemy power in wartime. Rumors, hearsay, a servant, bottles under a bed, and one witness who would not. Jean-Sylvain Bailly had been the first mayor of Paris and the president of the tennis court oath. He was one of the founding figures of the revolution itself. He had been arrested in July while sheltering with the astronomer Laplace, and on the 14th of October, 1793, he was brought before the tribunal and pressed to testify against her. He refused. In the printed record, he denies involvement in the affairs of the royal family. He protests against the accuracy of what is being put to him about the Champ de Mars and the declaration of war. They brought a man out of a prison cell to help kill a queen, and he would not do it. 29 days later, on the 12th of November, 1793, Bailly was guillotined. And they did not do it on the Place de la Révolution with everybody else. They moved the guillotine to the Champ de Mars, the field where the massacre he was blamed for had happened. The red flag he had raised to declare martial law was tied to the cart that carried him and burned in front of him before he died. It was freezing and raining. The crowd jeered him for the whole journey, and when somebody mocked him for shaking, he said that he trembled from the cold, not from fear. Hold that in your hand for a moment. Not as a conspiracy, just as a fact about a system. The man who declined to testify against her outlived her by 27 days. And then it was the 15th of October, and Hebert stood up. He deposed that the young Capet had attributed his knowledge to his mother and his aunt, that they had made him lie between the two of them, that there, in his phrase, the most unbridled debauchery took place. And he advanced a motive. He told the court that the acts had been designed to physically weaken the child, so that he could be politically controlled. And then Marie Antoinette asked him a question. Did you see it? He had not. He said so. She did not answer the charge. Herman, who by every account was visibly uncomfortable, moved to pass over it, and a juror stopped him. A juror intervened and insisted that she be made to answer. I want to say something about that man. He is not named, not in the French summaries of the record, not in the French or English scholarship, not anywhere I or my researchers could reach. The record simply says a juror. A list of 12 names survives, 4 of them well attested, and the rest not, and not one of them is attached to this. He is the most consequential anonymous person in this entire story. He turned a moment the court wanted to bury into the moment everybody remembers. Herman put the question to her formally, and she stood up. The French of what she said, in the fullest transcription available, is this. Si je n'ai pas répondu, c'est que la nature se refuse à répondre à une pareille inculpation faite à une mère. J'en appelle à toutes celles qui peuvent se trouver ici. In English, if I have not replied, it is because nature refuses to answer such a charge made against a mother. I appeal to all those women who may be here. The version that has come down to us and that is carved into the popular memory of France is shorter. J'en appelle à toutes les mères. I appeal to all mothers. The shorter version is almost certainly a smoothing of the longer one, and I would keep the longer one, because the words "who may be here" are what make it an act rather than a slogan. She was not making a speech to history. She was turning around in a room and speaking to specific women she could see. Here is what I can prove happened next, and here is what I cannot. What is documented is that the proceedings were suspended for 10 minutes. That is the fact I would hang the scene on. Not an adjective, not a description of the crowd. A court that had been sitting more or less continuously for 2 days stopped for 10 minutes. What is recollection, and mostly comes through a popular biography written in 1909, is the texture, that she half rose and cried out in a high voice and sank back, that the women in the galleries raised their voices against the ushers, that the crowd began to move and murmur. And there is a tradition that the market women who had marched on Versailles in 1789 were the ones who defended her. It is repeated everywhere and sourced nowhere, so I am not going to tell you it happened. There is also a story that Robespierre, dining elsewhere, heard what Hebert had done, broke his plate, and called him an imbecile for presenting the same woman as both Messalina and Agrippina, and thereby handing her a final public triumph. I could not trace that to any contemporary document. Every trail runs into secondary literature, so I am not going to give it to you as fact. What I will give you as fact is that 5 months later, Robespierre had Hebert killed. The Hebertists were arrested on the 13th of March, 1794, and Hebert was guillotined on the 24th. The accounts of his execution describe him fainting repeatedly on the way to the scaffold and screaming under the blade, while the executioners took their time. Now, why was that charge brought at all? Here is the answer, and it is the answer this whole episode has been walking toward. Because the prosecution had nothing. Fouquier-Tinville's file on the central charge was empty. The correspondence with foreign powers, the transmission of military plans, the things she had actually done, remained untraceable despite all searches. He had 41 people and no paper. So the case was converted. It stopped being a treason case, which required documents, and became a moral case, which required only a story. And the story was already written. It had been written across 20 years and 126 catalogued pamphlets. Messalina, Agrippina, the Tribade, the Mother. Chantal Thomas's argument, which I gave you an hour ago, is proved by a single piece of paper. The incest charge of October 1793 is not a legal argument. It is a pamphlet trope, extracted from an 8-year-old whom the accounts describe as drunk and dressed in judicial form. Did it backfire? Tactically, yes, and the evidence for that is the court's own behavior. The president of the tribunal tried to steer away from his own prosecution's most sensational charge. That is the tell. And the 10-minute suspension is the second tell. Strategically, it changed nothing whatsoever, because the verdict was never in doubt, and the collapse of the worst charge cost the prosecution nothing at all. They did not need it. It was theater, laid on top of a decision that had been made outside that room. The real effect of that moment took a century to arrive, and it worked in the opposite direction from everything Hebert intended. In front of a public gallery, in the middle of the terror, he turned l'Autrichienne back into a mother. The 19th century took that image and never gave it back. He tried to finish her, and instead he wrote her epitaph. And it did not save her, because by then there was nothing left to save her from. There were only 4 questions left. There were 4 questions, and they were built in pairs. The first asked whether it was established that maneuvers and communications with foreign powers had existed, tending to supply them with money and to help their armies. The second asked whether Marie Antoinette of Austria was convicted of having cooperated in them. The third asked whether it was established that a plot had existed to kindle civil war inside the Republic. The fourth asked whether she was convicted of having taken part in it. Look at the architecture of that. 2 facts and 2 participations. The jury was not asked whether she was guilty. It was asked twice whether a conspiracy had existed, and then twice whether she was in it. That was the tribunal's standard form. It was used in every case it heard. But look at what the standard form does here. It lets a juror say yes to the first question in each pair on the general political knowledge of the room, and then, having already said yes out loud once, say it again. And they said it out loud. That was the law, and I want to keep returning to it, because it is the mechanical heart of what that court was. 12 men, sitting under a law that had handed their appointment to the Committee of Public Safety and the Committee of General Security, standing in a public room in Paris in October of 1793, each one required to speak his verdict where every other man could hear him. The jury answered yes to all 4. How long they were out is not recorded. One account calls the deliberation brief. The scholarly assessment is that no deliberation details were preserved at all. I am not going to give you a number, because there is not one, and this is a story with enough real numbers in it that I do not need to borrow a fake one. It was about 4 in the morning on the 16th of October. Some sources say 4:30, and there is a plausible reason for the confusion that we will get to in about 2 minutes. She was asked whether she had anything to say against the application of the law. She shook her head. She said nothing. And then the sentence, and I want you to hear the whole of it, because of what is inside the second half. The said Marie Antoinette, called Lorraine of Austria, widow of Louis XVI, to the penalty of death. The present judgment shall be executed on the Place de la Révolution, printed and posted throughout the whole extent of the Republic. The sentence contains its own publication order. It does not merely condemn her, it instructs that the condemnation be printed and posted across France. And there was a printing press in the room next door. Now, her counsel, Chauveau-Lagarde, watched her hear that sentence, and the phrase he used afterward is this: she was like annihilated by surprise. He believed she had not expected it. He believed she had expected imprisonment. I find that genuinely hard to accept, and I have gone back and forth on it, because everything else about her conduct in that room suggests a woman who understood exactly where she was. But it is the testimony of the person standing next to her, and there is a version of it that makes sense. Her husband had been tried by the convention. She was being tried by a court, with counsel, with witnesses, with cross-examination, with rules. It is possible that the presence of the machinery made her believe in the machinery. She was taken back down to the cell, and at 4:30 in the morning, in a room she had been forbidden to write in for 6 weeks, someone gave her pen, ink, and paper. That is worth stopping on. Her writing materials had been confiscated after the Carnation. She had been reduced to punching letters through a scrap of paper with a pin. She had no right to write anything. The sentence of death restored it. Condemnation came with a formality attached, and the formality was a pen. She wrote 3 pages, and she wrote them to Madame Elizabeth, her husband's youngest sister, 29 years old, still in the temple with her daughter. The date line is in her hand, this 16th of October, at 4:30 in the morning, which is very probably why some sources give 4:30 as the hour of the verdict. The timestamp on the letter has bled backward into the timestamp of the sentence. Here is the opening. It is to you, my sister, that I write for the last time. I have just been condemned, not to a shameful death, for such is only for criminals, but to go and rejoin your brother. Then her children. I feel profound sorrow in leaving my poor children. You know that I only lived for them, and for you, my good and tender sister. And then the line that is doing the most legal and moral work in the entire document. Let my son never forget the last words of his father, which I repeat emphatically. Let him never seek to avenge our deaths. Look at the construction of that sentence. She is not issuing her own instruction. She is transmitting her husband's from his own final testament of December 1792 and endorsing it, the last surviving parent, ratifying the dead one's final command. That is a precise act, and she made it in the dark with just under 8 hours to live. And then the passage that I think is the single most extraordinary thing in this story. I have to speak to you of one thing which is very painful to my heart. I know how much pain the child must have caused you. Forgive him, my dear sister. Think of his age, and how easy it is to make a child say whatever one wishes. Read that again, slowly. 10 days after an 8-year-old's signature was used to accuse her, hours after that accusation had been read out in front of a public gallery, she wrote to the boy's aunt and asked her to forgive him. And she named the mechanism. Exactly. How easy it is to make a child say whatever one wishes. That is not a mother's sentiment. That is a correct forensic analysis of how the deposition of the 6th of October was obtained, written by the person it was used against, at 4:30 in the morning, in the hours before her execution. She forgave her son in writing, before it killed her. There is more. I pardon all my enemies the evils that they have done me. I beg pardon of all whom I know, and especially of you, my sister, for all the vexations which, without intending it, I may have caused you. I die in the Catholic, Apostolic, and Roman religion, that of my fathers, that in which I was brought up, and which I have always professed. And the close. Farewell, my good and tender sister. May this letter reach you. Think always of me. I embrace you with all my heart, as well as those poor dear children. My God, how heart-rending it is to leave them forever. Farewell, farewell. May this letter reach you. Hold on to that sentence. We are going to come back to it, and when we do, it is going to land considerably harder than it does right now. She also wrote in her prayer book. The inscription reads, "This 16th of October, at 4:30 in the morning. My God, have mercy on me." The court sent her a priest. He was a constitutional priest, which is to say, a priest who had sworn the oath to the civil constitution of the clergy, and which is to say, a priest of the Republic. Her husband had been permitted his own confessor. She was assigned one. She refused his ministry. She had already said in the letter that she would not speak to such a man and would treat him as a total stranger. The words reported from the cell are, "My conscience is at peace, sir. I shall appear before my God with confidence." He rode with her in the cart anyway. Now the morning, and this is Rosalie's account, and I am labeling it Recollection one more time, because it is the most quoted and least contemporaneous material in the entire story. She was still bleeding. She had to change her linen before she died. Rosalie says she asked to be shielded, and that she pulled her shawl back over her shoulders and said, with great gentleness, "In the name of decency, Monsieur, allow me to change my linen without a witness." The gendarme said, "I cannot consent to that." So she changed in front of him, with all possible precaution and modesty. Then she took the soiled chemise and hid it in her sleeve. She pushed it into a gap between the wall covering and the wall, so that nobody would find it. That is the last private act of the Queen of France, hiding her own blood in a wall so that men would not handle it. At about 7, she was offered food and said, "I do not need anything anymore. All is over for me." They made her change out of mourning into white. And here the sources split in a way that is worth naming, because both versions can be true, and the difference is the whole question of whether she chose anything at all that morning. One account has her keeping a white garment back deliberately for the end. Another, a hostile contemporary report, says the authorities compelled her to put on white against her wish to wear black. And the detail that makes it bite is this: white was the traditional color of mourning for queens of France. So if it was imposed on her, then what was imposed was the appearance of mourning stripped of the black she had actually been wearing since January. Either she chose the color of a queen's grief, or she was dressed in it against her will. I cannot tell you which. Her hair was completely white. The executioner removed her cap and cut it short in the cell, and bound her hands behind her back, and then they brought out the cart. Her husband had gone to the guillotine in a closed carriage, with his hands free until the final moment. She was put in a common prisoner's cart, a wooden platform on axles, pulled by 2 percherons, a plank to sit on, directly behind the horses, her hands tied behind her back, so that the whole of Paris could see her and shout at her on the way. That was a decision. Somebody made it. Multiple independent sources make the contrast between the closed carriage and the open cart explicitly, because everyone at the time understood exactly what was being said. 30,000 troops lined the route. The route was about 2.5 kilometers, and we can reconstruct most of it street by street. Out of the Cour du Mai, across the river, though the sources disagree about which bridge. Then the Rue de la Monnaie, the Rue du Roule, and a left turn into the Rue Saint-Honoré. And then a list of places that I do not think anybody planned, but which reads like something somebody planned. Past the Fontaine de la Croix du Trahoir, past the Oratoire, past a shop called the Grand Mogul, which had been the premises of Rose Bertin, the Queen's own fashion merchant, the woman who had built the silhouettes that the pamphlets had spent 20 years costing out in livres. Past the Palais Royal, a forced halt at the Church of Saint Roch, then on along the Rue Saint-Honoré, past the house of the Duplay family, where Maximilien Robespierre lodged. In the space of one street, she passed the shop that had dressed her and the house where Robespierre slept. The times are disputed. She left the conciergerie somewhere between 10:15 and 11 in the morning, and reached the Place de la Révolution around noon. So the journey took somewhere between 1 and 2 hours to cover 2.5 kilometers. Cries of hatred were heard along the Rue Saint-Honoré, and somewhere along that street, a man sketched her from a window. You have seen that drawing. Everybody has seen that drawing. Pen and brown ink on cream paper, about 15 centimeters by 10, in the Louvre. A woman upright on a plank with her hands behind her back and her hair cropped under a bonnet, and an expression that people have been arguing about for 2 centuries. It has been captioned in every documentary ever made about her as a sketch by Jacques-Louis David, drawn from life as the cart went past. The Louvre's own 2020 exhibition at the Conciergerie reattributed it to a different artist, Dominique Vivant Denon. The grounds are technical, and they are good. David habitually sketched in pencil. This is pen and ink. And here is the consequence, which almost nobody has followed through. If Denon drew it, he cannot have been there. Denon did not return to Paris until the middle of December, 2 months later. On that reading, the most famous eyewitness image of the death of Marie Antoinette is not an eyewitness image at all. I want to be careful. The attribution is contested, not settled. There is a handwritten note by the drawing's early owner saying it was drawn by the pen of David, a witness to the convoy, at a window. That note is the basis of the traditional story, and it is real. But if you have seen that image captioned as drawn from life, you should at least know that the exhibition that reattributed it gave it to a man who, on the best evidence, was not in Paris that day and would not return for 2 months. The record is full of holes like that. The trial transcript gets her age wrong. The delay request is missing from the file. The most famous image may be an invention. The most famous sentence was never said. At 12:15, it was finished. She lost a shoe going up the steps. That shoe survives. It is in the collection of the Musée des Beaux-Arts in Caen. It was the centerpiece of an exhibition there in 1989. You can look up the record of that exhibition in the departmental archives of Calvados. She stepped on the executioner's foot, and she apologized to him. "Monsieur, I beg your pardon. I did not do it on purpose. I have to tell you that those words are tradition, not record. French sources themselves frame it as what legend holds. Everyone reports that she apologized for treading on the man about to kill her. Nobody can produce the document. It is too good a line to launder. So I am telling you exactly what it is. Even the identity of the executioner is not settled. The Sansons were a dynasty. Charles-Henri Sanson had executed Louis XVI in January. The French sources give the son, Henri Sanson, for October. The English tradition gives the father. And the memoirs that would settle it were published in 1830 and are apocryphal, having been written in part by the novelist Honoré de Balzac. So a man whose name we cannot establish, using an account written by a novelist 40 years later, killed the last Queen of France at 12:15 on a Wednesday. Afterward, the head was lifted by the hair and shown to the crowd, and somebody shouted, "Vive la République!" Now the ledger. The body went to the Madeleine Cemetery on the Rue d'Anjou. It was the same ground where her husband had been buried in January. The Swiss guards of the 10th of August were already lying there, and so were the dead of the Champ de Mars. The gravedigger was a man named Joly, and Joly's expense memorandum survives. For the coffin of the widow Capet, 6 livres. For the grave and the gravediggers, 25 livres. 31 livres to bury the Queen of France. I want you to hold that number against another one. The necklace she never bought, never saw, and never signed for was contracted at 1,600,000 livres. That is not an argument. That is arithmetic. And arithmetic, unlike testimony, cannot be ruled inadmissible. Quicklime was spread over her. She was put in at about 5 feet. Her husband had been buried at 10 to 12 feet, with lime inside the coffin, as well as over it. And Joly did one thing on his own initiative that nobody instructed him to do. He put her body in a wooden coffin, and he put it near the king's grave. A gravedigger in Paris in October of 1793 made a private decision to bury a woman next to her husband. That decision is the only reason anybody could find her 21 years later, because they did come looking. In 1815, with the Bourbons restored, a commission opened the ground on the 18th of January at 8 in the morning. They found her first. About 5 feet down, inside a bed of quicklime 10 or 11 inches deep that had hardened into a crust and preserved the outline of a coffin about 5 feet 6 inches long. The official report says the skull was entire and that its position indicated incontestably that it had been severed from the body. They recovered bones, 2 elastic garters in good preservation, fragments of women's clothing and hair. The garters and the clothing were matched against garments she had worn at the conciergerie. They found the king the next morning, and it was harder. His lime had mixed into the earth instead of forming a crust. There was no clothing and no hair. There were the bones of a man and a skull covered in lime, placed between the leg bones. I should say that the identification has been challenged. A critique published in 1924 argued that the ground was too disturbed and too saturated with lime for certainty. It also noted that the men who owned the land and guided the dig were interested parties. The commission's answer was that the lime crust preserved rather than destroyed, that multiple independent witnesses corroborated the locations, and that the clothing and hair were positive matches. No DNA test has ever been performed on the remains at Saint-Denis. The son's heart has been tested. His mother's bones have not. On the 21st of January, 1815, the coffins were carried in procession to the Basilica of Saint-Denis and lowered into the royal vault, where they are now, under a slab of black marble. The 21st of January, the 22nd anniversary of Louis XVI's execution, to the day. Now the letter. She gave it to the gaoler on the morning of the 16th. He was afraid for his own head, and he did not send it. He handed it to Fouquier-Tinville, and Fouquier-Tinville signed it. 3 deputies of the convention also signed it. Those signatures are physically on the paper. It was not delivered. It was filed as evidence. Some time after that, it left the tribunal's files and ended up in the private papers of Maximilien Robespierre. How and when is not documented, and I am not going to invent a mechanism. What is documented is where it physically was in July of 1794, because that is where it was found. After Robespierre fell, a deputy named Edme Bonaventure Courtois was appointed to inventory his papers, and on the 30th of July, 1794, he took custody of them. He found the letter. He did not report it. He kept it. He held it privately for more than 20 years, understanding perfectly well what it was worth. And then, in January of 1816, under the restored monarchy, Courtois was proscribed as a regicide because he had voted for the death of the king. On the 12th of January, he was ordered into exile. On the 25th of January, he wrote to a counselor of state of Louis XVIII. He offered the royal documents in his possession, explicitly including a letter written by Marie Antoinette. He wanted permission to stay in France. He was exiled anyway. Louis XVIII got the letter, had it published, and ordered that it be read aloud in the churches of France every year on the 16th of October. 23 years. From 4:30 in the morning on the 16th of October, 1793 to 1816, seized by the prosecutor who convicted her and signed by him, passed into the papers of the man who ran the terror, suppressed for 2 decades by a man who wanted to trade it for permission to stay home, and finally published by a king who turned it into an annual liturgy. Whether the physical sheet of paper ever reached her daughter, the sources do not agree. What is certain is that in 1816, Marie Thérèse learned what her mother had written. She was 37 years old that year. It is the age her mother had been on the scaffold. The original is in the Archives Nationales in Paris, and Madame Elisabeth, the woman it was addressed to, never read a word of it. On the 9th of May, 1794, she was taken from the temple to the conciergerie in pouring rain and interrogated at 10 that night. On the 10th, she was tried. The charges were conspiring to restore absolute monarchy, facilitating the flight to Varennes, sending diamonds to the émigrés, and abetting the defenders on the 10th of August. Her counsel was Chauveau-Lagarde again, and this time he was not permitted to interview his client. She was guillotined that day, aged 29, with 24 other people, and she went last, which means she watched all 24 of them go before her. She was buried in a mass grave with quicklime, and her remains were never recovered. There is nothing of her at Saint-Denis. She died 206 days after Marie Antoinette wrote to her, "May this letter reach you." It did not. It went into a file, then into a dead man's papers, then into a drawer for 22 years. The woman it was addressed to had already been dead for 2 months when it went into that drawer, and she stayed dead through every year that followed. And the boy, he was never told his mother was dead. The Simons left in January of 1794 with a signed receipt for their ward. What happened to him after that is described in Restoration histories. A sealed room, bolted and barricaded, straw to sleep on, no sanitation, food passed through bars. That is the martyrology tradition, and I flag it as such. What is not in dispute is that when Paul Barras came to see him after Thermidor, he found a child so still he assumed he was asleep, curled in a cot because standing hurt him, with swollen knees. From late October of 1794, he stopped speaking. He never started again. One of the men who looked after him afterward said it was a decision the boy had taken on the day he made his deposition against his mother. He died on the 8th of June, 1795, aged 10. The autopsy gave a scrofulous infection of long standing, which in modern terms is tuberculous lymphadenitis. One of the 4 physicians noted that in more than 40 years of practice, he had never seen a brain so well developed in a child of that age. In his last days, he was delirious and said he could hear music and his mother's voice. He did not know she was dead. The last thing he is recorded as saying was to his attendant, "Do you think my sister could hear the music? It would make her so happy. I have something to tell you." The physician who performed the autopsy secretly removed and kept the boy's heart, following the old tradition for French royalty. It was preserved in distilled wine, which evaporated over about a decade, and then it was simply a dry, mummified organ in a glass urn. That urn spent the next 2 centuries being handed from person to person, offered to Louis XVIII, who refused it because he did not believe it was authentic, given to the Archbishop of Paris, recovered from a sacked palace in 1830, passed to a son, then to a collector, then to a Carlist claimant in Austria, then to his sister, then to her daughter, and eventually to the president of the Saint Denis Memorial. In the year 2000, it was tested. Mitochondrial DNA, which passes strictly down the maternal line, which means it tests motherhood, which is exactly what was needed. 2 laboratories, in Münster and in Leuven, working independently. They compared it against hair from Marie Antoinette, hair from 2 of her sisters, hair from the Empress Maria Theresa, and living maternal line descendants. It matched the Habsburg maternal line. It is her son's heart. The historian Jean Toulard put it carefully, and I will use his words rather than a flat claim. We can never be 100% sure, but this is about as sure as it gets. On the 8th of June 2004, the 209th anniversary of his death, the heart was interred at Saint-Denis, in a niche beside the tombs of his parents. It was carried by a 12-year-old boy. The mother's letter took 23 years to arrive. The son's heart took 209 years to be buried next to her. Now let me close the ledger on the people in that courtroom, because the record is unusually tidy about them. Jacques-René Hebert, who brought the deposition, was guillotined on the 24th of March, 1794. 5 months. Antoine Simon, who obtained the signature, was guillotined on the 28th of July, 1794, in the same batch as Robespierre. Jean-Baptiste Michonis, the prison administrator, was guillotined on the 17th of July, 1794. Marshal Herman had steered away from his own prosecution's worst charge. Antoine Quentin Fouquier Tinville had signed her last letter and not sent it. They were guillotined together on the 7th of May, 1795, at about 11 in the morning. Fouquier Tinville's own trial lasted 41 days. It heard 419 witnesses, 196 for the prosecution, and 223 for the defense. Now put those 2 numbers side by side. The prosecutor of Marie Antoinette got 41 days and 419 witnesses to answer for what he had done. She got 2.5 days and 41 witnesses. His defense was that he had only executed the orders of his superiors. "It is not I," he said, "who ought to be facing the tribunal, but the chiefs whose orders I have carried out." Jean-Sylvain Bailly, who refused to testify, died 27 days after her. Axel von Fersen, who organized Varennes, was lynched by a mob in Stockholm on the 20th of June, 1810. The 20th of June is the anniversary of the night the coach left Paris, and Chauveau-Lagarde lived. He was questioned by the Committee of General Security immediately after the trial as to whether he had defended her too well and talked his way out of it. He went on to defend Madame Elisabeth. When the law of 22 Prairial abolished defense counsel, he withdrew to Chartres and was arrested for showing too much leniency toward counter-revolutionaries. His warrant ordered him before the tribunal in 3 days. He sat in detention for about 6 weeks, which is what saved him, because 6 weeks carried him past the 9th of Thermidor. He was released. He became president of the Paris Bar and a counselor of the Court of Cassation, and he died in 1841 at the age of 85. And here is where our 2 documents meet. The Paris Order of Barristers holds, in its museum, 4 pieces of paper from that trial. One of them you have already met, the commission of the 12th of October that made him her lawyer. It holds Fouquier Tinville's act of accusation. 8 leaves, the one Fabricius read aloud to a full courtroom on the morning of the 14th of October. It opened by calling her a leech and comparing her to Frédégonde. It reached back a decade, into events the Republic's own law could not touch. It holds her written request to the President for 3 days, unanswered. And it holds an 8-page manuscript acquired in 1989 of Chauveau-Lagarde's notes for the defense. 8 pages. And here is the thing about that. 8 leaves is 16 sides of paper. 8 pages is 8. The accusation was physically twice the length of the defense, and it is the only one of the two that anybody ever heard. He spoke for nearly 3 hours, and most of it was improvised, and no transcript of it was ever made. Not by the court, not by the press, not by anyone. Those 8 pages are the closest thing that exists to the defense of Marie Antoinette. His opening is written out. Citizens jurors, it begins. Marie Antoinette, former Queen of France, stands before you accused of conspiring at home and abroad. And then he tells them to put aside their prejudices and confine themselves to the acts of accusation before them. He stood in front of 12 men who had to vote out loud, in the 6th week of the Terror, and he asked them to ignore everything they thought they knew about the most written about woman in Europe. 8 leaves were read aloud to a packed room, and the verdict they produced was printed and posted across the Republic. 8 pages were never read to anyone at all. So, what is the verdict on the verdict? I am not going to tell you she was innocent, because she was not. I gave you the file an hour ago, and I am not taking it back. She maintained a private channel to a foreign court for 23 years. She pushed French policy toward Austria and succeeded. She attempted to reach a frontier fortress with foreign organization and foreign money. She ran a secret paid political operation with a man she was deceiving. And in 1792, with France at war, she passed military information to the other side. The historian least impressed by the pamphlet scholarship and most impressed by her political intelligence is the one who calls her clearly guilty of it. And I am not going to tell you it was a fair trial, because it was not, and the reason it was not is not the reason people usually give. It was not unfair because it was a rubber stamp. It had counsel, witnesses, cross-examination, and a defendant whom the surviving record never once catches in a contradiction across 2 days. It was unfair because the great majority of the indictment concerned events that the Republic's own penal code, in force from the 1st of October 1791, could not reach, because there was no appeal by the founding decree's own words, because the naming of jurors had been handed to the 2 great committees 5 weeks earlier, and because those jurors had to vote aloud, because her lawyers had 2 days and a pile of papers that needed weeks, because she asked for 3 of those days, and the request is not in the file, and because on the one charge that was both timely and true, the prosecution could not produce a single sheet of paper, searched for it, failed to find it, and reached instead for an 8-year-old. Both of those things are true at the same time. She did it, and they could not prove it, and so they convicted her of something else in front of a full gallery. That is not a paradox. That is what happens when a system decides on the outcome first and then goes looking for a road to it. It does not require monsters. It requires a prosecutor with an empty file and a deadline, a president who would rather not look at what his own side is doing, and 12 men who have to say it out loud. And then, having killed her, that system did the one thing nobody in the room intended. It made her a mother. For 20 years the pamphlets had worked to turn her into a category, Madame Deficit, l'Autrichienne, the new Agrippina. And on the 15th of October, 1793, a man stood up and pushed that project to its absolute limit. The room stopped for 10 minutes. The woman in the raised chair stood up and spoke to the women she could see. The 19th century took that image and would not give it back. Which is why, When the myth finally needed a sentence to hang on her, it did not reach for anything she said in that courtroom. It reached instead for a joke Rousseau told about buying bread that was already 15 centuries old, and that a satirist tried and failed to disprove 50 years after her death. Let them eat cake. She never said it. It is not in the pamphlets, not in the press, not in the indictment, not in the transcript, not in her letters. The words the record preserves from her final statement were these: "No one has articulated against me any positive fact, and I was only the wife of Louis XVI, and it was necessary that I should conform to his will." Nobody quotes those. There is no transcript of the man who defended her. There is no page in the tribunal's file where she asked for 3 more days. The only copy that survives is the one her own lawyers kept. The record of that trial is mostly a record of what is not in it. She wrote 3 pages at 4:30 in the morning and asked that they reach her sister. The prosecutor signed them and put them in a drawer. Her sister died without reading them. Her daughter read them 23 years later, at exactly the age her mother had been when she wrote them. They are carved now into the walls of a chapel built on the ground where she was buried for 31 livres. The words are on the stone. The letter never got there.